Julius Streicher murdered without ever touching a weapon, killed without ever entering a concentration camp, participated in genocide without ever personally selecting victims for death or operating gas chambers or issuing deportation orders. His instrument was language. His method was repetition. His strategy was the systematic dehumanization of an entire people through propaganda so relentless and so comprehensively distributed that it poisoned the consciousness of millions and created the psychological conditions that made mass murder seem not just permissible, but necessary. At his execution on October 16th, 1946, his final words before the trapdoor opened were "Heil Hitler," demonstrating to the very end his complete identification with the ideology he had spent decades propagating, and his absolute refusal to acknowledge that the words he had published had contributed directly to the murder of hundreds of thousands. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today we dissect Julius Streicher, examining how a failed teacher transformed resentment and sexual obsession and ideological hatred into a propaganda apparatus that reached millions and that made anti-Semitism not just acceptable, but enthusiastic and violent. Julius Streicher was born on February 12th, 1885 in Bavaria, became a teacher after completing his training, yet experienced this career as failure and humiliation because teaching did not provide the significance or recognition or power that his grandiose sense of himself demanded. He was by all accounts a mediocre teacher who struggled with classroom discipline and who resented the constraints and low status of his profession, who felt that the world had failed to recognize his true worth, who searched for explanations and targets for the rage that comes from the gap between how someone experiences their own importance and how others actually perceive them. His anti-Semitism developed during this period of frustrated ambition and sexual obsession, becoming fused in his mind with elaborate sexual fantasies about Jewish men seducing Aryan women, with conspiracy theories about Jewish control of finance and media and culture, with narratives that explained his own lack of advancement as the result of Jewish manipulation, rather than as the consequence of his actual limitations. The psychological function of this anti-Semitism was to provide him with an enemy onto whom he could project all his resentment and failure and sexual anxiety, to transform his personal inadequacy into participation in a cosmic racial struggle where his hatreds became virtues. When he joined the Nazi Party in the early 1920s and met Hitler, he discovered someone who validated his anti-Semitic obsessions and who provided him with an organizational structure through which his hatred could be transformed from private resentment into public propaganda. Hitler recognized in Streicher someone useful despite his obvious personal failings and his reputation for corruption, because Streicher possessed a talent for vulgar, emotionally charged propaganda that reached audiences who might not respond to more sophisticated ideological arguments. In 1923, Julius Streicher founded Der Stürmer, a weekly newspaper that would become the most vicious anti-Semitic publication in Nazi Germany, achieving circulation that eventually reached 500,000 copies, an influence that extended far beyond its readership, because copies were displayed in public showcase boxes called Stürmerkasten throughout Germany, ensuring even people who never purchased the newspaper would encounter its messages daily. The newspaper's content was characterized by crude, sexual accusations against Jews, by conspiracy theories that portrayed Jews as controlling and corrupting German society, by grotesque caricatures that depicted Jews as subhuman creatures, with exaggerated features designed to trigger visceral disgust responses. The psychological sophistication of the Stürmer lay in its exploitation of basic mechanisms of emotional conditioning. The constant repetition of simple messages that became embedded in memory through sheer frequency regardless of their truth value. The use of emotionally charged language and imagery that triggered fear and disgust before rational thought could engage. The framing of complex problems through simplistic narratives that provided clear enemies and simple solutions. Streicher understood intuitively what propaganda research would later confirm, that repeated exposure to messages shapes belief regardless of whether those messages are true, that emotional appeals bypass critical thinking, that dehumanizing imagery makes violence psychologically easier by breaking down the empathy that would normally prevent it. The newspaper became required reading in schools and was actively promoted by Nazi authorities who recognized its effectiveness at spreading anti-Semitic ideology. Teachers displayed the Stürmer in classrooms. Students were assigned to read and discuss its articles. The grotesque caricatures were incorporated into educational materials, teaching racial science, creating a comprehensive propaganda environment where children absorbed anti-Semitic ideology during their formative years, when personality and moral frameworks were still developing. The propaganda techniques that Streicher employed reveal how dehumanization operates at the psychological level and how repeated exposure to dehumanizing content gradually transforms ordinary people's perceptions. The caricatures depicted Jews with exaggerated noses and grotesque features that communicated disease and danger and fundamental otherness, creating visual associations between Jewish identity and concepts of contamination that operated at preconscious levels and shaped emotional responses before rational thought could engage. The sexual accusations exploited deep anxieties about purity and protection, triggering protective aggression and moral outrage that could be channeled toward justifying violence against Jews as defense of the community. The cumulative effect of this constant exposure was to create moral disengagement, a psychological state where normal mechanisms that prevent violence against other human beings are systematically disabled, through the targeted group being cognitively reclassified as something less than fully human, and therefore not deserving of moral consideration and empathy. Research on genocide has demonstrated that dehumanizing propaganda is nearly always a necessary precondition for mass violence, that populations must be prepared psychologically through sustained exposure to messages that strip targeted groups of their humanity. Streicher's influence on specific acts of violence can be traced through documented cases where individuals who committed anti-Semitic attacks cited der Stürmer as their inspiration. During Kristallnacht on November 9th to 10th, 1938, when synagogues and Jewish businesses were destroyed throughout Germany, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Many participants later testified that the propaganda they had absorbed from der Stürmer had convinced them that Jews posed such a threat that violent action was justified. Streicher himself, though not directly involved in planning Kristallnacht, had spent 15 years preparing the psychological ground that made such violence possible. At the Nuremberg trials, Julius Streicher was charged with crimes against humanity based on his propaganda activities, establishing the legal precedent that incitement to genocide through propaganda could be prosecuted as a criminal act, even when the propagandist had not personally participated in physical violence. The prosecution demonstrated through testimony and through evidence from Der Stürmer itself that Streicher had knowingly published material designed to incite violence against Jews, that he had continued and intensified his propaganda even after systematic extermination had begun, that he had celebrated the violence and called for complete elimination of Jews from existence. Streicher's defense consisted of claiming that his newspaper had simply been expressing opinions and that freedom of expression protected his right to publish anti-Semitic material, an argument that the tribunal rejected by establishing that propaganda designed to dehumanize and to call for violence crosses the boundary from expression into criminal conspiracy and complicity in genocide. He showed no remorse during the trial, continued to express anti-Semitic views, appeared to genuinely believe that history would vindicate him and that his propaganda would be recognized as having served a necessary purpose rather than as having contributed to one of history's greatest crimes. When the verdict of death by hanging was announced, Streicher shouted anti-Semitic slogans and claimed martyrdom, maintaining his complete identification with Nazi ideology and his absolute refusal to acknowledge any responsibility for the consequences of his decades of propaganda. Julius Streicher's life reveals uncomfortable truths about the power of propaganda and dehumanizing speech to prepare populations psychologically for participating in or tolerating genocide, demonstrating that words and images can be weapons as lethal as any physical instrument when deployed systematically to strip targeted groups of their humanity and to create permission structures for violence. The techniques he employed were universal principles of propaganda and psychological manipulation that remain available to anyone who seeks to incite hatred and violence. The warning extends to contemporary societies, where similar techniques are visible, dehumanizing language directed at immigrant populations or religious minorities, conspiracy theories that portray targeted groups as threats, constant repetition of simplistic narratives that reduce complex problems to the malign influence of clearly identified enemies. The psychological mechanisms that made Der Stürmer effective: exploitation of fear and disgust, use of repetition and emotional appeals to bypass critical thinking, gradual normalization of dehumanizing language through constant exposure. These remain potent wherever they are deployed. This has been Forgotten Minds. Julius Streicher was hanged for crimes against humanity committed through propaganda, establishing that those who incite genocide through dehumanizing speech bear responsibility for the violence that follows. Yet the techniques he pioneered continue to resurface wherever hatred seeks justification and wherever populations can be manipulated into seeing designated enemies as less than fully human. Until next time, stay vigilant,